My daughter looked me up and down, taking in my worn boots and faded flannel shirt, and curled her lip in disgust. "Your life is nothing to be proud of." She sneered, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, so her wealthy future in-laws inside wouldn't hear. "Don't show up to the wedding," I didn't yell. I didn't argue, I simply nodded, turned around, and walked away. That same afternoon, I quietly canceled every single payment funding her lavish lifestyle, and made absolutely sure her wedding day became the most humiliating day of her life. The name is Eugene Hartley, though just about everyone in town has always known me as Gene, 69 years old, and for the past decade my refuge has been the grease-stained, dusty garage bolted onto the side of my modest three-bedroom house, suburban Marietta, Georgia. That Tuesday afternoon, the air hung heavy with the scent of motor oil and worn leather. I was buried elbow-deep under the hood of my classic Ford F-100 pickup, locked in a battle with a seized carburetor, and entirely at peace with the world. My hands were caked in grease, the stubborn kind that burrows into your cuticles and takes the better part of a week to scrub clean. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. I'm glad you're here. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something powerful about knowing that people from all different places sit down to hear the same story on the same day. A note worth keeping in mind: some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio experience, and any resemblance to real people or specific events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. My favorite classic rock station was playing low in the background. Simple, quiet, just the way I wanted it. Then gravel popped and crunched under tires, and my focus broke. I dragged an oily wrist across my forehead, smearing a dark streak above my eyebrow, and walked out of the garage to see what was coming. A high-gloss lease sedan turned into my driveway and rolled to a stop, dust blooming around its tires. Out came my daughter Vanessa, 28 years old, and her fiancé Derek right behind her. Derek was 32, the kind of man who wore suits that ran more than my first car, and he held some junior executive title at a big commercial real estate outfit downtown. Perfectly groomed, permanently smirking, that face of his had a way of tightening every muscle in my jaw. "Dad, really?" Vanessa let out a long sigh, her gaze moving over my stained overalls like I was something tracked in on a shoe. She pressed her designer bag against her body as though the Georgia red clay might reach up and ruin it on its own. "We're running behind schedule. I said we were coming." "Always good to see you, sweetheart," I told her, dragging my palms across an old shop rag. Derek had stayed back near the car, carefully keeping his polished shoes away from anything resembling dirt. "Gene," he said, chin up, giving me one of those stiff little nods that said he was doing me a favor by acknowledging me at all. His eyes swept my property and landed on the old truck sitting in the bay. "Still messing around with that heap? Most men your age have figured out what a fairway looks like. I guess there's a certain charm to a small, uninspired life. Heart rate stays nice and low, I imagine." I kept my smile easy. "Stays me occupied, Derek. Keeps the hands from going idle." Vanessa's eyes went to the sky. She dug into her bag and came out with a fat envelope. "We're not staying. This is the final bill, caterer, plus the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom, Johns Creek, Georgia. It's steep, I know, but Derek's family won't accept anything less than their standard, and that's not negotiable. The grant funds should land next week, but the vendors need you to coordinate payment now." I pinched the envelope between a grease-blackened thumb and finger, keeping the paper as clean as I could. $150,000, I said, turning it over. "That's one heck of a celebration." "Think of it as capital Gene," Derek cut in, tugging his cuffs straight. "Image is currency in my world. Success draws success, that's how it works. My firm's senior partners will all be in that room. The CEO may even appear, though the man moves like a shadow. This is the upper-tier Gene. No offense, but a grease monkey doesn't really have a frame of reference for high-level professional relationships." I held his gaze. My smile didn't move an inch. "You're probably right, Derek. Engines are my lane." What Derek had no idea about, what neither of them had ever suspected, was that I was something far beyond a man who fixed engines. Standing there, calm breathing, slow watching this self-satisfied junior executive who figured he had life mapped out. I knew the truth. He didn't. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Hartley Commercial Real Estate, the exact firm where Derek spends his days fetching coffee and trying to claw his way up the corporate ladder. I'd built that company from bare ground alongside my late wife Lorraine. We had nothing at the start except stubbornness and a vision we both believed in. When Lorraine died a decade ago, whatever ambition I'd had for boardrooms and balance sheets went with her. I transferred the day-to-day running of things to the board, faded into the background, and finally claimed the unhurried life I'd long promised Lorraine we'd one day share. Vanessa had never been let in on the real shape of our fortune. Lorraine and I made that call deliberately. We didn't want our daughter measuring her worth by a trust fund. She grew up comfortable, but the billions stayed out of sight. "Just handle the paperwork, Dad," Vanessa said, pulling me back into the moment. The way she looked at me wasn't how a daughter looks at her father. It was how someone looks at a plumber who's gone over his estimate. "We've got a cake tasting." "It'll be handled, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice level. They backed out and drove off, dust curling up behind them, and I stood there in my driveway holding that envelope. She was still my child, condescension and all. My plan had been to astonish them both. I intended to cover the full $150,000 myself, wipe the whole bill clean as a wedding present so the two of them could walk into their marriage without debt hanging over their heads. I pushed through the screen door and let it slam behind me. The house was modest. It was spotless. First stop was the kitchen sink, where I worked heavy-duty pumice soap into my hands and scrubbed until the grease surrendered and my skin went red and raw. Then, I pulled out the chair at my oak dining table, settled my reading glasses onto my nose, and tore open the envelope. My laptop came next, old and thick and utterly unremarkable to look at, and I navigated to an encrypted browser. From there, I logged into the secure portal for Lorraine Holdings, the blind trust I had quietly built years before. That trust was the engine behind Vanessa's entire lifestyle, the penthouse, the prestigious-sounding academic grants. She'd spent years believing she earned those scholarships that corporations had chosen her on merit. Not once did she guess that her grease-stained father was the silent hand funding every bit of it. I moved through the invoices methodically, ready to authorize the wire transfers to each vendor. The catering figures were steep but defensible. The florist's rates were high, though they matched what imported garden roses Vanessa wanted actually cost. Then I turned to the venue invoice: Atlanta Athletic Club Ballroom, Johns Creek, Georgia, and something on the third page stopped me cold. Buried in the line, items was a charge labeled Administrative and Logistics Fee, $20,000. I pushed my glasses up and read it again. In decades of commercial real estate work, I had never once encountered an administrative fee package quite like this one. The money wasn't headed to the Atlanta Athletic Club. It was addressed to a third-party LLC. Something in me, the part that never fully left the boardroom, came alert. I pulled up a fresh tab and ran a fast, discreet search on that LLC. The filing date 3 months ago. The registered agent was a boilerplate corporate services outfit, the variety that exists purely to put a wall between a company and whoever actually owns it. Shell structure, textbook clean, the type I had flagged and unraveled dozens of times back when I was auditing questionable contractors in the 80s. I pushed back in my chair and let the kitchen's quiet surround me. How was $20,000 of wedding money finding its way into an LLC that didn't exist 4 months ago? And there was Derek handing me that specific invoice with that specific look on his face. I could have grabbed my phone. I could have put the question straight to Vanessa and let her answer for it. But the years I'd spent in hard-edged commercial real estate had burned one principle into me permanently. You don't move on an irregularity until you've seen the whole picture. Call too soon, and you give people room to build a cover story before you've collected anything solid. I needed to be in the room with them. I needed to watch their faces. I tucked the venue invoice into the breast pocket of my flannel jacket and closed the laptop. The wedding RSVP sat on the counter where I'd left it. That would be my excuse. I'd bring it to Vanessa's place in person and slip the question about the administrative charge into the conversation, casual as anything, and study how Derek handled it. I locked up and climbed into my Ford F-100 pickup, and the engine turned over. 40 minutes of driving the world outside the windows, trading out lawns and low rooftops for towers of glass and polished steel. The same towers I held the deeds to. Vanessa's building claimed one of the priciest addresses in the city. The doorman pressed uniform's stiff posture, took one look at my scuffed boots and worn flannel, and decided he didn't trust me. The guest list overruled him, and he walked me to the elevator and sent me up to the penthouse floor. Stepping out, my boots sank into the plush carpet of the corridor. Nearing Vanessa's door, I picked up the noise spilling from inside, loud, well-fed voices, the kind that carry the easy confidence of old money. Crystal glasses, real laughter, that particular register of people who've never been told no. Derek's people were there. I stepped up to the door and knocked knuckles firm against the heavy wood. The voices dropped a register. Someone moved inside. The door opened a crack and Vanessa's face appeared. The moment she registered me, the blood seemed to leave her all at once. "Dad!" She breathed barely above a whisper, sliding out into the hallway and sealing the door behind her. "What are you doing here?" "Dropping off my RSVP," I said, holding the card out steady. "And there's one line on that venue invoice I'd like to walk through with Derek. A fee that doesn't quite add up." She didn't glance at the card. She didn't ask about the invoice. Her eyes went straight to my clothes, scanning from collar to boots. Her eyes swept over my worn work boots, my faded jeans, the red flannel jacket I'd had on my back for 15 years. Her face contorted into something close to revulsion. "You cannot be here right now," she whispered, her voice tight with barely contained fury. "Derek's parents are inside. They flew in from the coast. They are prominent people, Dad. They move in circles you cannot even comprehend." "I am just here to drop off a card and ask a question," I said, keeping my voice even, despite the cold knot tightening in my gut. "No." She stepped forward, her voice loaded with contempt. "You don't get it. Derek's parents are high society. They believe my father is a respectable retired consultant. If they catch you walking in here dressed like that, smelling of motor oil and garage dirt, it is humiliating. Do you have any idea how hard I have worked to fit into Derek's world?" I stood there without moving. The daughter I'd cradled as an infant, the girl I had secretly bankrolled, shielded and loved without condition, was staring at me like I was a blemish on her carefully constructed life. "I am your father," I said quietly, "and right now, you are an embarrassment." She fired back, folding her arms across her chest. She drew a slow breath, her eyes flat and pitiless. "Your life is nothing to be proud of, Dad. You have settled for mediocrity. I am marrying into a family of winners, so do me a favor. Take your RSVP and go. In fact, don't come to the wedding at all. Everyone is better off if you simply stay away." The hallway went completely silent. Behind the heavy door at her back, faint strains of classical music and the soft clink of glasses drifted through, a cruel contrast to the wreckage unfolding in that corridor. This was the moment cruelty crystallized into something deliberate. It was not a flare of temper. It was a cold surgical removal. She was excising me from her life, the way you'd cut away a dead limb, because I didn't fit the image she'd built. I absorbed that betrayal in full. The pain in my chest was sharp, almost physical, but it dissolved fast into a deep glacial calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't lay out every sacrifice her mother and I had made for her. I looked into her eyes and found a stranger staring back, a woman hollowed out and refilled with something shallow and corrosive. The silence between us pressed down like a weight. I slowly drew my hand back, slipping the RSVP card into my pocket. "Understood," I said, my voice stripped of anything resembling feeling. "I will stay out of your life." I turned away from her and moved toward the elevator. I didn't look back when I heard her apartment door click shut behind me. The emotional center of my world had just given way. But as the elevator doors closed, sealing me off from her floor, the grief burned off like morning fog. What rose in its place was a cold, precise resolve. She wanted her high society wedding without her worthless mechanic father cluttering up the picture. She was about to discover exactly what her perfect life had been built on. I didn't head back to my quiet street in suburban Marietta, Georgia. I didn't return to the grease and the familiar comfort of my garage. As those elevator doors slid shut, something fundamental shifted deep inside me. The paternal instinct that had run my life for 28 years, the relentless drive to protect and provide for my little girl, simply went out like a flame starved of air. In its place settled a cold, absolute clarity, the kind that only arrives once a devastating truth can no longer be denied. For years I had played the role she needed me to play. I let her believe the story that she was a self-made woman, sustained by prestigious academic grants and anonymous corporate sponsorships. I let her future husband parade around treating me like hired help, while every paycheck he cashed was signed by a company I built. I did it because I loved her. I did it because I wanted her to have everything, without ever feeling the full weight of what everything costs. But today she proved that having the world had cost her her soul. I walked out of that luxury building past the doorman's sneer and stepped back up into my old Ford F-100 pickup. I turned the key and the engine came to life, but I didn't aim the hood toward home. I pointed it toward the downtown Atlanta financial corridor. Traffic was thick, but it barely registered. My mind had become a steel trap, clicking methodically through every variable, every necessary move. The downtown skyline filled the windshield ahead, that forest of glass and steel I knew as well as my own hands. I pulled the truck right up to the front plaza of the towering Hartley Commercial Real Estate Headquarters, downtown Atlanta, Peachtree Street Corridor, Georgia. It was an imposing wall of reflective glass, a monument to the decades of sweat and sacrifice my late wife and I had poured into that business. A young valet in a pressed uniform jogged over looking uneasy. He clearly wanted to wave me off, figuring I was a lost delivery driver or a confused contractor blocking the executive entrance. I handed him the keys and a $50 bill and told him to park it out front and leave it right there. He stared at the bill, then at my faded flannel jacket and said nothing at all. I walked past him and pushed through the revolving doors. The main lobby was a cathedral of polished marble and vaulted ceilings. Suits and briefcases moved through it like a current. The air carried expensive cologne and freshly brewed espresso. 2 security guards moved to intercept the scruffy old mechanic who'd wandered into their executive sanctuary. But the senior guard, an older man who'd been with the company since the early days, reached out and caught his partner by the arm. He knew my face. He gave a respectful nod and stepped aside, opening the path. I didn't pause at the reception desk. I crossed straight to the private executive elevator, swiped a master key card I hadn't touched in over 2 years, and pressed the button for the top floor. The ride up was quiet. I watched the floor numbers climb and felt the last remnants of the soft suburban father peel away. The man walking out of this elevator was not a handyman. He was someone who had been asleep for a very long time and had just opened his eyes. The top floor was hushed, muffled by thick carpeting and the dense atmosphere of serious money. I moved past a row of stunned administrative assistants. One rose to stop me. I walked right past her and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the chief financial officer's suite. Mr. Fenn sat behind a vast desk ringed by glowing monitors tracking global markets and asset portfolios. Fenn was a sharp, meticulous man who had overseen my private wealth for more than a decade. When the door swung open, he looked up with a scowl, ready to dress down whoever had the nerve to interrupt him. Then he saw me. He came to his feet so quickly his chair rolled back and struck the paneled wall. He stammered, straightening his glasses, saying he hadn't seen me in this office since the board meeting 3 years ago and asking if everything was all right. I crossed to the leather chair opposite his desk and sat down. I didn't take off my jacket. I told him I needed him to pull up the master accounts for Lorraine Holdings, my voice low and even. He blinked at the abruptness of it, but immediately settled back into his seat, and his fingers began moving rapidly across the keyboard. He brought up the blind trust, the financial engine that had been quietly funding my daughter's penthouse, her designer wardrobe, her luxury trips, her extravagant way of life. He told me he had it right there and noted that the scheduled transfers to the wedding vendors were queued for release. The venue, the florist, the caterer, all of them set to clear by the close of business that day. I told him to freeze it, freeze the entire trust, cancel every pending transaction, and revoke every authorized credit line. Fenn stopped typing. His hands hung motionless above the keyboard as he looked up at me with something close to disbelief. The glow of the monitors threw pale light across his stunned face. He warned me that if he froze the account at that moment, every one of those wedding checks would bounce immediately. The caterer, the florist, the Atlanta Athletic Club, Ballroom, Johns Creek, Georgia, all of them would be looking at insufficient funds notices by tomorrow morning. I held his gaze and told him that was precisely the point. Cancel them all. Fenn swallowed, leaning forward and settling his elbows on the mahogany desk. He felt he had to lay out the full consequences. He reminded me that the trust had been structured to pay her luxury rent automatically on the first of every month. If we locked it down, her landlord would be issuing an eviction notice within 48 hours. She would have no access to the emergency credit lines. Her car lease payments would fail. She would be completely cut off, and the wedding would collapse instantly because her fiancé didn't have the personal funds to cover even a fraction of those costs. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city I had spent a lifetime building. I thought about my daughter in that expensive hallway, telling me I was an embarrassment. I thought about the naked disgust on her face when her eyes dropped to my work boots. She wanted to inhabit a high society world she'd decided I had no right to enter. She wanted everyone to believe her wealth sprang from her own brilliance and her fiancé's corporate standing. She wanted me gone. I turned back to Fen and told him that my daughter had looked me in the eye today and told me my life was worthless. She had told me I was nothing to be proud of, and that I should stay away from the wedding because I would humiliate her in front of her new family. Fen watched me, his expression shifting from professional detachment into something closer to stunned understanding. He knew how deeply I loved that girl. He knew I had constructed the trust, so she would never have to scrape the way her mother and I did in those early lean years. He grasped what it must have taken for her to push me to this point. I told him, let us see how much her perfect wedding is worth without me. Not a flicker of hesitation in my voice, not a trace of regret. I told him to shut it down every single dime. Cut the cord right now. Fen didn't argue. He swiveled back to his monitors. The only sound in that vast office was the rapid clicking of his keyboard, a few keystrokes, a final command entered, and then silence. He told me quietly that it was done. Lorraine Holdings was completely frozen. Every outbound transfer had been terminated. The safety net had been pulled away. I rose from the chair and straightened the collar of my flannel jacket. The trap was set. The first domino had been pushed, and there was no road back from here. I watched the green indicators on Fen's monitors bleed to red as the freeze rippled through the system. The vast financial machine that had quietly sustained my daughter's life ground to a halt. I expected to feel some surge of satisfaction. Instead, the room just felt cold. I was about to turn and walk out when Fen cleared his throat. He told me to wait. He was studying the pending transactions queue, brow creased in concentration. He pointed to a specific line item the system block had just rejected, a $20,000 administrative fee from the venue invoice, the same charge that had caught my attention earlier that afternoon in my kitchen. Fen tapped his pen against the desk. He said the billing structure for this particular vendor was completely irregular. Country clubs didn't route administrative fees to newly incorporated shell companies with separate banking networks. He asked if I wanted him to run a hard trace on the routing numbers before he locked down the portal entirely. I told him to do it. I drew up a leather chair beside him and watched the data stream across his dual monitors. Fen bypassed the standard search engines and went straight into the clearinghouse networks. Money always leaves a trail, no matter how carefully someone tries to sweep it clean. The business was registered through a generic corporate service in Georgia, a classic screen designed to obscure the real owner. But the banking destination told a different story. The wire instructions pointed to a private wealth management account at a regional bank. Fen pulled the account details. Seconds later, a name surfaced on the screen. Derek. My future son-in-law wasn't simply padding the wedding budget. He was actively siphoning my trust funds into his own private account. He was billing his own wedding and pocketing the administrative fee as straight cash. A quiet, dangerous anger settled over me. I asked Fen to do one more thing. I had told him to cross-reference Derek's personal routing number against the internal vendor payout system for Hartley Commercial Real Estate. Derek worked in the acquisitions department, managing enormous budgets for property development. If he was brazen enough to steal from a blind trust, he was brazen enough to steal from his employer. Fen's fingers moved fast across the keyboard. He bridged my private wealth portfolio with the company's internal accounting network, tapping into the corporate mainframe. We sat in silence while the search algorithm combed through thousands of vendor payments spanning the past 2 years. The screen blinked, then it flooded. Row after row of corporate payouts filled the display. $5,000 here, $12,000 there, $30,000 for supposed consultation services on commercial lots that had already been fully developed. Every one of those fabricated vendor invoices had been funneled through different dummy corporations, but they all led to the same destination, Derek's private bank account. Fen took off his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes. He said, "We were looking at systematic embezzlement. Derek had been bleeding the company for at least 18 months. The stolen total was well over $400,000. I stared at the figures, scrolling past my reflection in the monitor. Suddenly, the picture of Derek standing in my driveway snapped into focus. The expensive tailored suits, the leased luxury sedan, the designer watches he wore like armor, none of it was earned. He was a fraud financing his entire high society image with money pilfered from my life's work. I closed my eyes and drew a slow, measured breath. The faint smell of paper and polished wood in the office receded, and for a moment I was carried back to a warm summer evening years ago. My late wife Lorraine and I were sitting on our back porch watching a teenage Vanessa climb into a sports car with a neighborhood boy who had more ego than sense. Lorraine had rested her head on my shoulder and exhaled softly. She told me she worried about our daughter. She said Vanessa was blinded by fool's gold. She warned me that Vanessa was drawn to boys who loved the appearance of wealth far more than the character it takes to build it. Lorraine had seen it even then that our daughter confused a heavy wallet with a good man. I opened my eyes, and the memory dissolved back into the cold reality of the boardroom. Lorraine had been entirely right. Vanessa hadn't just chosen an arrogant snob. She had chosen a common thief, a man who looked me in the eye, mocked my simple life, and called me uninspired, all while wearing clothes bought with money he'd stolen from my company. Fen broke the silence. He reached for his office phone and asked whether he should contact the police. He said we had enough digital evidence to have Derek arrested for corporate fraud before the day was out. I placed my hand over the receiver and pressed it back down. I told Fen to wait. An immediate arrest would be too quiet. It would play out behind closed doors. Vanessa would inevitably shape the narrative, casting the company as the villain and conjuring some excuse for Derek's behavior. She would say the corporate world was cutthroat, or that he'd made a simple accounting error. I knew my daughter. She would defend her high society illusion at any cost. I got up from the desk. I told Fen we were not calling the police today. We were going to let Derek believe he was walking away clean. We were going to let him pull on his expensive tuxedo stand before his arrogant parents and prepare to marry my daughter. We were going to let the pressure build until he had nowhere left to stand. Derek thought my life was nothing to be proud of. He thought he was the sharpest man in the room, running circles around a grease-stained mechanic. He had no idea that the mechanic he'd just banned from the wedding was the CEO of his company, the owner of his stolen funds, and the man who was about to dismantle his entire existence piece by piece. The financial freeze was already in motion. The wedding checks would bounce by morning. Derek's stolen money was drying up, and his panic would drive him into the open. I told Fen to prepare a full corporate audit, wrapping every piece of this embezzlement into an airtight legal trap, and to have it ready by the end of the week. I walked out of the office, leaving the glowing screens behind me. The hallway felt different now. It carried the stillness of something deliberate, the calm that settles just before a very intentional storm. Derek and Vanessa had told me to stay out of their perfect world. They were about to learn that I was the only thing holding that world together, and I had just pulled out the foundation. Fen still had his hand hovering over the heavy receiver of his desk phone. He looked at me with the kind of urgent, wound-tight energy you'd expect from a financial officer who has just uncovered a massive corporate theft. He pressed me to call the authorities that very second. He said, "We had all the digital routing numbers, the forged invoices, and the offshore transfers nicely tied up in a neat digital bow." He wanted to see Derek in handcuffs before the sun went down. It was the logical, responsible course of action. It was exactly what any ordinary chief executive would do. But I wasn't just a chief executive facing a thief. I was a father facing a profound betrayal. I told Fen to take his hand off the phone. He blinked, visibly thrown by how composed I was. I explained that an immediate arrest was the worst move we could possibly make. If the police quietly picked Derek up at his office on some random Tuesday afternoon, my daughter would take control of the story within the hour. She would cast herself as the tragic heroine. She would say her brilliant fiancé had been framed by envious colleagues, or that it was a routine accounting misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a ruthless corporate machine. Vanessa had always possessed a remarkable talent for rewriting history to suit her needs even as a teenager. She would excuse his crimes, cover for him, and spend the rest of her life performing the role of victim. She had spent years perfecting the craft of building false realities around herself. If I simply handed Derek over to the police behind closed doors, she would never have to face the truth. She'd spend her days blaming the world for destroying her fairy tale. To truly shatter a delusion, you can't just nick the glass. You have to wait until they've built their glass house as high as it will go. Then you pull the foundation out from under it. I needed the collapse of her illusion to be absolute, public, and beyond any possible denial. I needed her to see the man she chose over her own father for exactly what he was, with no shadows to retreat into and no excuses left standing. I turned to Fenn and told him we were going to launch a full external corporate audit, not an internal review conducted by people Derek might know or work around. I wanted independent, hard-nosed auditors who answered to nobody but the board of directors and the federal financial regulators. I instructed him to bring in the most aggressive accounting firm in the city. They were to go through the entire acquisitions department, every file, every expense report, every vendor contract Derek had put his hands on over the past 2 years. Fenn nodded slowly, the shape of what I was building settling over his face. He noted that an external audit of that scale would place enormous pressure on Derek. As the auditors worked their way toward his department, he would feel the walls tightening around him. He'd be sitting in his glass office watching the accountants move from desk to desk, fully aware they were tracing missing money. He would know they were coming. He just wouldn't be able to stop them. That was exactly the point. The psychological squeeze was going to be excruciating. But the most critical element of my plan was the timing. I leaned across the heavy mahogany desk and gave Fenn precise instructions on how to schedule the auditors. They were to work around the clock, mapping every stolen dollar and constructing an airtight case of embezzlement and fraud, but they were not to finalize the compliance report until the end of the week. Fenn glanced at his calendar and asked which exact day I wanted the final legally binding report delivered to the authorities. I looked him straight in the eye and said, Saturday. Not just Saturday, specifically Saturday afternoon, at 3:00 in the afternoon. Fenn swallowed hard. He knew precisely what was happening on Saturday afternoon. That was the exact moment my daughter was scheduled to walk down the aisle in her $15,000 dress. That was the exact moment Derek would be standing at the altar before 200 high society guests performing the role of a wealthy, successful executive. The trap was engineered with care. By the time the wedding march played, the blind trust checks would have already bounced, sending Derek into a silent panic as he scrambled to placate furious vendors. He'd be sweating through his tailored suit, straining to hold the facade together. And at the precise moment he believed he'd buried his crimes and married his way into wealth, the audit would fall on him like an anvil. I stood up from the desk and smoothed the collar of my worn flannel jacket. I told Fenn I wanted the auditors to produce a physical copy of the final report, printed sealed in a heavy manila folder, and placed directly in my hands on Saturday morning. Fenn agreed, his voice carrying a blend of awe and quiet unease. He promised the trap would be laid exactly as I had directed. No one inside the company would know I was the hand moving the pieces. To the outside world, and to Derek in particular, the audit would appear to be a random terrible stroke of bad luck. To Vanessa, I would remain the invisible mechanic, the embarrassing father who hadn't been invited to the party. Neither of them would have any idea that the man they had banished from their lives was the architect of their undoing. I walked out of that towering corporate building and stepped back into the bright afternoon sun. The city moved and hummed around me, completely unaware that a massive financial trap had just been armed inside one of its towers. I climbed back into my Ford F-100 pickup and gripped the worn leather steering wheel. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel heavy. The grief over the daughter I had lost had gone quiet. In its place was a calm, clinical resolve. Derek and Vanessa had wanted me out of their perfect world. They were about to discover that their perfect world only existed because I had allowed it to. I turned the key, listening to the old engine catch and rumble to life. The countdown had officially begun, and I intended to make sure they felt every single second of it. The drive back from the glass and steel of the downtown Atlanta financial corridor to the quiet, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood felt like crossing between two different worlds. I rolled the windows of the truck all the way down and let the warm afternoon air move through. I listened to the steady note of the engine, a sound I had tuned with my own hands. There was no rage left in me, only a deep quiet. I pulled into my short concrete driveway, killed the ignition, and stepped out into the still suburban afternoon. This was the life I had chosen, a life of quiet dignity. I walked up the drive, but didn't go inside my empty house. Instead, I pulled my battered red toolbox from the truck bed and headed next door. My neighbor, Ruth Ann, was a 72-year-old widow with a heart of pure gold and a front porch that had been sagging for the better part of a year. I had promised her last week that I'd reinforce the support beams. Today felt like exactly the right day to keep that promise. I needed to work with my hands. I needed the honest weight of a hammer and the rough grain of raw wood to rinse away the sterile corporate greed I'd been swimming in all afternoon. Ruth Ann pushed open her screen door with a wide, warm smile. She had on a faded floral apron, and her hands were dusted with flour from baking. She scolded me lightly for working in the afternoon heat, but her eyes were full of real gratitude. I crawled under the wooden structure of her porch, measuring the rotted beams and cutting fresh lumber to brace the foundation. The physical work settled something inside me. Sawdust coated my flannel jacket and sweat blurred my eyes, but I felt a deep, steady peace. This was honest work. This was helping a neighbor for no reason other than that it was right. No hidden agendas, no administrative fees routed to shell companies, no desperate clawing after status. As I drove the heavy galvanized nails into fresh wood, I thought about the yawning distance between my world and the one my daughter was so determined to belong to. Vanessa believed wealth was measured by the label sewn into a dress or the zip code printed on a lease agreement. She thought my grease-stained hands were a mark of failure. But lying in the dirt beneath a sagging porch, I knew the plain truth. Real wealth is not a number in a bank account. Real wealth is being able to look at yourself in the mirror without a shred of shame. It is the freedom to sit in silence without the crushing weight of debt or the exhausting performance of pretending to be someone you are not. I had millions of dollars in offshore accounts and corporate trusts. But my real fortune was the quiet integrity of this exact moment. 2 hours of steady work, and the porch was solid and level. I packed my tools away and knocked the dirt from my jeans. Ruth Ann wouldn't hear of me leaving. Without sitting a spell, she steered me toward a wicker chair under the shade of her awning and disappeared inside. A moment later, she returned with 2 tall glasses of cold lemonade, clinking with fresh ice cubes, and a plate of warm pecan shortbread. We sat together in the quiet, listening to the faraway drone of a lawnmower and the soft stir of oak leaves overhead. Ruth Ann talked about her grandchildren, how they rang her every Sunday just to hear her voice. Her grandson had made a 3-hour drive simply to help her put in a small vegetable garden out back. She didn't have a penny to leave any of them, and yet they loved her without condition or reservation. I sat there listening and felt the full weight of just how hollow my own daughter really was. Vanessa had been handed everything she could want, and she discarded her father the moment he stopped fitting the picture she was building. Ruth Ann had nothing beyond a sagging porch and a warm kitchen, and she was the wealthiest woman on that street. I lifted my glass and took a long, slow drink, feeling the condensation run down onto my rough fingers. It was a still, unhurried afternoon. The world felt like it was sitting exactly where it belonged. Then the heavy silence in my pocket came alive. My cell phone let out a sharp burst of vibrations. One, then another, then another. A quick chain of notifications cutting through the suburban calm. I pulled the old phone from my pocket and looked at the screen. It was lit up with automated alerts forwarded directly from the secure portal of Lorraine Holdings. I stood there reading the glowing text, taking in the digital confirmation of what I had set in motion. Insufficient funds, transfer denied, account frozen. The large payment to the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom had bounced. The wire to the luxury florist had been rejected at the clearinghouse. The catering deposit had failed to process. The payments on her luxury apartment lease were blocked. Every financial pillar holding up Vanessa's immaculate high society life had just been knocked out at the knees. I quietly locked the screen and eased the phone back into my pocket. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I took another calm bite of pecan shortbread and looked out at the still suburban street. The first domino had officially gone down. Somewhere across town, in her subsidized luxury apartment, my daughter was probably getting a very bewildering call from her wedding planner. The invisible safety net she had never once questioned, the one she had leaned on her entire adult life, was simply gone. The calm before the storm had ended, and the financial hurricane was now making landfall. I leaned back in the wicker chair, sipping my lemonade, and let the panic begin without me. I didn't need to be inside Vanessa's luxury penthouse apartment, Midtown Atlanta, Georgia, to know exactly how it was unfolding. Mr. Fenn's digital alerts told the whole story. Tuesday morning, the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom, Johns Creek, Georgia, venue manager, ran a hard inquiry on the initial deposit. It had bounced. By Tuesday afternoon, the luxury florist and the high-end caterer had each received the same insufficient funds notice. Vendors in that world don't negotiate. In the world of high society weddings, money talks and empty promises walk. They gave Vanessa 48 hours to produce $150,000 in cleared funds, or the whole perfect day would be canceled. I had access to the recorded logs of the frantic voicemails Vanessa began leaving on the secure helpline for Lorraine Holdings. The trust maintained a dedicated phone number run by a corporate service built to field her questions and manage her supposed grant disbursements. Her first call was polite if strained. She assumed a simple banking error. She explained that her wedding vendors were threatening to release her date and asked the customer service team to push the wire transfers through immediately. When no callback came, she dialed again. And again. Each time her voice climbed a little higher, a little more frantic. By the fifth call, every trace of composure had burned off. She demanded a supervisor. She shouted that she was a top-tier academic recipient and that this kind of delay was completely unacceptable. But there were no supervisors left to take the call. I had directed Fenn to pull the human operators offline. On her sixth attempt, Vanessa was met with a cold automated recording. It stated plainly that the account tied to her portfolio had been permanently closed. All associated funds were revoked. The balance was zero. I could only picture the color leaving her face as she lowered the phone. The invisible wand that had covered her luxury rent, dressed her in designer clothes, and bankrolled her extravagant life had vanished. She was staring at a six-figure wedding bill with no means whatsoever to pay it. And then there was Derek. My future son-in-law was caught in his own private nightmare. He wasn't simply losing a free wedding, he was losing the $20,000 administrative fee he had tried to pocket through his shell company. But his greed was entirely eclipsed by his ego. He had invited the senior partners from Hartley Commercial Real Estate, headquarters, downtown Atlanta, Peachtree Street, Corridor, Georgia, to this wedding. He had invited his wealthy, arrogant parents who had been boasting to every acquaintance at their country club about their son's lavish life. If the venue canceled due to bounced checks, Derek would be exposed as a fraud right in front of the audience that mattered most to him. His standing in the high society circles he worshipped would be ash by morning. Panic is a dangerous thing. It convinces arrogant men they're untouchable right up until the moment the ground disappears beneath them. Sitting in my quiet garage suburban Marietta, Georgia, I received a secure message from Fenn. The digital trap we had laid inside the corporate office had just been sprung. Derek was at his glass desk at the real estate firm, sweating through his designer suit. The vendors were demanding immediate payment by wire transfer. He knew he didn't have the personal funds to cover it. His parents had already told him their money was tied up in investments. He had no one left to turn to. Driven by a toxic blend of desperation and naked pride, he made the fatal mistake I had been counting on. He logged into the corporate acquisitions portal, the same one he had been quietly bleeding for the past 18 months. But skimming $5,000 here and there was one thing entirely. Wiring $150,000 out in a single afternoon to cover a wedding venue and a caterer was financial suicide. Derek didn't care. He was going under, and he grabbed for the largest life preserver within reach. He drafted a massive wire transfer, routing the stolen corporate funds through a complex web of vendor accounts, trying to dress it up as a legitimate property development expense. He hit submit certain he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he could move the money, keep the vendors satisfied, and quietly shuffle the accounts afterward to cover his trail. He had no idea he had just stepped straight into the jaws of the trap. Every keystroke was being watched. The aggressive external auditors I had brought into the corporate network were already there monitoring his digital footprint in real time. They cataloged the fake invoices. They traced the routing numbers. They captured his login credentials. The instant Derek pressed the button to wire those stolen funds to the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom, the auditors locked the evidence down cold. Fenn called me a few minutes afterward. His voice carried the weight of genuine disbelief. Derek had actually done it, initiated a massive reckless transfer of company funds straight to the wedding venue. The sheer audacity of the theft was staggering. Fenn asked whether the bank should stop the wire before it cleared. I wiped a smudge of oil from my hands and looked out through the garage window. I told Fenn to let it go through. Let the money reach the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom account, so the vendors would hold the date. The venue needed to believe they'd been paid, so the event would proceed exactly as planned. But I also told Fenn to notify the federal financial authorities immediately. The bank would quietly flag the transfer as part of an active criminal investigation. Derek believed he had saved his wedding. He thought he'd outmaneuvered the system and locked in his perfect high society day. He was going to put on his charcoal black bespoke tuxedo and smile for the cameras, completely unaware that the money he used to buy that smile was about to deliver him to federal prison. The financial cascade had done its work. It had forced the thief out into the light, and the final phase of the execution was now firmly set. The sun had already slipped below the tree line, pulling long, dark shadows across the driveway. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, watching the evening news, with the volume turned low. The house was perfectly still. Then my cell phone began to ring. My daughter's name glowed on the screen bright against the dim kitchen. I didn't pick it up right away. I let it ring. I took a slow sip of coffee, felt the warmth ease down my throat, and counted the rings. On the fifth ring, I finally pressed the green button and brought the phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. I just waited. The voice that came through wasn't the polished, arrogant tone of the high society bride I'd encountered in that apartment hallway. It was the frantic, hyperventilating sob of a woman whose entire world was going up in flames. She was crying so hard she could barely string a sentence together. She gasped between words, her voice pitched high with raw panic. She told me her academic grant had been terminated. She said her bank accounts were overdrawn, and her landlord had taped an eviction warning to her front door. The caterer was threatening legal action, and the luxury travel agency had canceled her non-refundable honeymoon to Santorini, Greece. She was going under fast. Then came the desperate plea. She asked whether I knew anyone who might be able to help some wealthy client whose vehicles I'd worked on over the years, or a local business owner willing to extend a private loan. She needed to know if there was any way to get her hands on $100,000 immediately to cover the remaining wedding costs and pull her back from total ruin. I sat at my quiet kitchen table and listened to her weep. A month ago, the sound of my daughter in tears would have moved mountains. I would have torn the world apart to fix it for her. I would have emptied my own accounts, sold my truck, and worked my hands raw just to bring a smile back to her face. But that version of me was buried the moment she looked at my work boots with contempt and told me I was an embarrassment to her existence. I kept my voice absolutely flat, no warmth, no fatherly comfort anywhere in it. I told her I couldn't understand why she was coming to me for that kind of money. I reminded her of her own words. I said, "I'm just a simple mechanic." I told her my days are spent covered in grease and motor oil. I said, "I don't move in the elite circles that you and Derek belong to." I fed her own devastating words back to her, calm and deliberate. I told her my life is nothing to be proud of, which made it completely illogical for her to think a useless old man like me could produce $100,000. The line went stone silent, the sobbing cut off, instantly replaced by a stunned, breathless void. She understood. I was throwing her cruelty directly back at her. She realized I wasn't going to be her safety net. When she finally spoke, the panic had curdled into blinding, vicious rage. She screamed into the phone. She called me a failure. She yelled that a real father would find a way to rescue his daughter's dream, instead of sitting there bitter and useless. She blamed me for not working harder, for accepting mediocrity, for not being the wealthy, powerful man she needed me to be in that moment. She unleashed a venom that would have hollowed me out a few weeks before. Now, it simply confirmed everything. She slammed the phone down so hard the line cracked and went dead. I lowered the phone and set it gently on the wooden table. A deep, settled peace moved through me. The line had been drawn and it had held. But the wreckage from that call didn't end in my kitchen. The psychological unraveling was only beginning to take root across town. Though I was miles away, the digital alerts coming through the corporate audit team painted a vivid picture of the fracture happening inside her luxury apartment. Vanessa was backed into a corner, no money, no father riding to the rescue, and an eviction notice hanging over her head. She channeled every ounce of her frantic rage toward the only person left standing beside her, Derek. She demanded he fix it. She demanded he drain his savings, go to his arrogant parents, or take out a massive personal loan to salvage their social standing. But Derek was already suffocating beneath the weight of his own catastrophic choices. He had just wired a massive sum of stolen corporate money to the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom to hold the date. He thought he'd stop the bleeding, but Vanessa was screaming at him about the debts still piling up. The caterer, the florist, the travel agent, and the landlord were all circling. Derek couldn't steal again. He knew that pulling another $100,000 from the corporate accounts so soon after the first massive wire would instantly trip the internal security systems at the real estate firm. He was trapped. He paced the apartment floor, sweating, flinching at every sound from the hallway. He was obsessively refreshing his banking apps, terrified that federal authorities were already drawing up a warrant. The pressure was immense, and it split their perfect high society partnership right down the middle. They were no longer the polished power couple trading on their elite image. They were two desperate, frightened people turning on each other like cornered animals. Derek snapped at Vanessa, telling her she was reckless with money and fixated on meaningless details. Vanessa fired back, accusing him of being a fraud who couldn't deliver on any of the promises he'd made. She told him he was failing her. He told her she was a spoiled brat. The facade was dissolving into a toxic pool of blame and desperation. They were sleeping in separate rooms. They were drinking heavily to dull the dread. Derek was showing up at the corporate office hollow-eyed and wrecked. He was convinced that every email from the finance department was the notification that would end his freedom. He jumped every time his desk phone rang. He watched the external auditors move through the office corridors, completely unaware that those same auditors had been handpicked by his future father-in-law to build his prison cell, brick by brick. The emotional weight was dismantling them from within. They had constructed their entire identities on the illusion of wealth, and without my money propping up that illusion, there was nothing left beneath it but their own hollow, grasping greed. The stage was perfectly set. They were bruised, paranoid, and financially broken. All that was left was the final blow. I finished my coffee, switched off the kitchen light, and went to bed knowing that Saturday was going to be a very memorable day. The afternoon heat had settled deep into the concrete of my garage suburban Marietta, Georgia. I was at the workbench polishing a carburetor piece, losing myself in the steady rhythmic motion. The quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the aggressive screech of tires. A car jerked to a stop at the edge of my driveway. I set down the polishing cloth and watched the driver's door swing open. It was Derek. The junior executive, who usually looked like he'd walked straight off the page of a luxury magazine, was completely unraveling. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose. His collar hung open, and dark sweat stains soaked through the underarms of his tailored shirt. His hair, normally slicked into perfect place, was a chaotic wreck. He looked exactly like a man who could feel the walls of a federal prison closing in around him. He practically stumbled up the driveway, gripping a leather portfolio. He forced a smile that landed closer to a grimace, and the panic vibrating underneath it was unmistakable. "Gene," he said, breathing hard, stopping at the threshold of my garage. "I'm really glad you're home. I need to talk to you man to man." I picked up a shop rag and wiped the grease from my fingers, slow and deliberate. I didn't invite him in. I just leaned back against the workbench and looked at him. I asked him what he wanted. Derek swallowed hard. His eyes swept around my garage, taking in the old tools and the concrete floor, like a man searching for a lifeline in a junkyard. He moved closer, dropping his voice, working to sound intimate and conspiratorial. "Look, Gene," he started, his hands trembling slightly. "Vanessa is an absolute wreck. The wedding is falling apart because of some banking error with her academic grant. You know how much this day means to her. It's her dream. And as the men in her life, we have a duty to step up and fix it." I tossed the rag onto the bench. I told him I'd already made clear to Vanessa that I didn't have $100 to $1,000 sitting around. Derek took a step closer, crowding my space. The smell of stale coffee and nervous sweat came off him in waves. "I know you don't have cash," he said quickly, "but you have this house. I ran the numbers, Gene. Property values in this neighborhood have gone through the roof. You own this place outright. You could take out a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit. The bank would approve it by tomorrow morning if we pushed them." I stared at him and let the sheer audacity of what he was asking hang there in the humid air. He was standing in my garage asking me to put my home on the line, the house where I had lived with my late wife, the house where I had raised my daughter, just to bankroll a single day of high society theater. He wanted me to risk my own shelter to pay off vendors because he had already bled my company dry and was scrambling to cover his tracks. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I was not about to take out a mortgage on my home to pay for Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom appetizers and imported flowers. The answer was no. Absolutely no. The manufactured smile on Derek's face collapsed instantly. The fake camaraderie vanished, leaving nothing behind but pure, undiluted venom. The corner of his mouth twitched. He let out a harsh, ugly laugh and dragged a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. He moved right up into my face, voice dropping into a vicious sneer. "You're pathetic, you know that. He spat. Vanessa told me you were a failure. I just didn't realize how far that went. Your own daughter is begging you to save the most important day of her life, and you won't even put your name on a piece of paper. You're a useless old man who let his family down. He jabbed a shaking finger at my chest. You're going to die in this filthy garage reeking of oil, and not a single person will care. You're mediocre, Gene. You've always been mediocre, and Vanessa deserves 1,000 times better than the sorry excuse for a father she ended up with. He stood there chest heaving, waiting for me to detonate. He expected shouting, maybe a shove. He wanted me to play the uneducated blue-collar stereotype he'd already decided I was. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I simply studied this desperate sweating thief who fancied himself a titan of industry. I thought about the massive external audit currently tearing through his department at Hartley Commercial Real Estate Headquarters, downtown Atlanta, Peachtree Street, Corridor, Georgia. I thought about the federal authorities combing through his forged wire transfers at that very moment. I thought about the complete devastation waiting for him on Saturday afternoon. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Not amusement. The smile of a predator watching the jaws of the trap close. I told him quietly that he was absolutely right. I'm just a simple mechanic. I said, and I'll stay right here in my garage. I told him to go ahead and head back to his corporate office. I wished him the very best of luck with his financial troubles. Derek recoiled, slightly rattled by my total absence of anger. The cold smile clearly unnerved him, but his ego was far too large to let him understand why. He scoffed, shaking his head in contempt. He muttered that I was a waste of breath spun on his heel, and stormed back down the driveway. He dropped into his leased luxury sedan, hammered the door shut, and peeled off down the street, blowing straight through a stop sign, in his hurry to get away. I stood in the garage doorway and watched those red tail lights vanish around the corner. The smile stayed on my face a good while longer. He genuinely believed he'd just torn into a broke, irrelevant old man. He had absolutely no idea that he had just unloaded on the chief executive officer of his own company. He didn't know he'd verbally attacked the sole owner of every dollar he had stolen. He had cemented his own fate with a single tirade of arrogant pride. I switched off the garage lights and walked inside. Every final piece was in position. It was time to go buy a tuxedo. 48 hours before the ceremony, I found myself seated in a windowless conference room, deep inside the Atlanta FBI Financial Crimes Field Office, downtown Atlanta, Georgia. The air conditioning held a low, steady hum that matched the quiet intensity filling the room. I was no longer in my grease-stained flannel. I had put on a clean button-down and a modest sport coat, a small shift, but a deliberate one. Seated across from me were 2 seasoned federal detectives and a senior prosecutor. To my right sat Mr. Fenn, my chief financial officer, looking sharp as a blade. He had brought 2 thick leather-bound binders holding the complete findings of the external audit. We were well past suspicion and hunches. We were dealing in cold, indisputable mathematics. Fenn slid the first binder across the polished table and opened it to a highlighted page detailing the massive wire transfer Derek had initiated just days before. He walked the detectives through every step of the digital breadcrumb trail. He showed them how Derek had accessed the corporate acquisitions portal, bypassed the secondary security protocols, using stolen credentials, and routed $150,000 of company funds through 3 separate dummy corporations before aiming it straight at the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom, Johns Creek, Georgia. The lead detective, a sharp-eyed woman with 20 years chasing white-collar criminals, traced her finger along the printed routing numbers and let out a low whistle. She noted that thieves usually buried stolen money in offshore accounts or cryptocurrency. Derek had literally wired stolen corporate funds directly to pay for his own wedding reception. She called it a breathtaking display of arrogance and stupidity. I settled back in my chair and watched them work. I told the detective that arrogance is precisely what makes a man sloppy, that he had been desperate to preserve his high society image, and desperation breeds fatal mistakes. The prosecutor reviewed the summary page and gave a slow nod. He confirmed they had more than enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant for felony embezzlement and wire fraud. A slam-dunk case, but then he looked up from the file with a frown and raised a complication that made my pulse tick a little faster. He explained the bureaucratic reality of the banking system. The massive wire transfer Derek had authorized was currently suspended in a digital holding pattern within the Federal Clearinghouse. To legally seize the stolen funds and reverse the transaction back to Hartley Commercial Real Estate headquarters, the prosecutor needed a federal judge to sign a specific asset freeze order. The judge assigned to this jurisdiction was out of town until Friday night. The prosecutor folded his hands on the table and looked me straight in the eye. The freeze order would absolutely be signed, he said, but it would not hit the banking network until the financial institutions opened for weekend processing. The funds would be officially seized and pulled from the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom's pending ledger on Saturday morning. He apologized for the delay and told me the arrest warrant couldn't be executed until Saturday afternoon. He thought he was delivering bad news. He assumed I'd be frustrated that the man stealing from my company was getting 2 more days of freedom. I showed no frustration at all. Instead, a slow, deep wave of satisfaction moved through me. I glanced at Fen. Fen looked back at me. He knew exactly what Saturday meant. I turned back to the prosecutor and kept my voice remarkably steady. I told him Saturday was perfectly fine, that Saturday morning was precisely the right moment for the bank to pull the money from the venue. I told the detectives to take all the time they needed and execute the arrest warrant on Saturday afternoon. I assured them I knew exactly where the suspect would be standing. We closed the meeting with firm handshakes all around. The legal trap was fully armed and entirely out of my hands, an unstoppable machine bearing down on the wedding day. I walked out of the field office into the bright city sunlight. Fen fell into step beside me carrying the empty binders. He stopped on the sidewalk and asked how I was feeling. He wanted to know if I was ready for what was coming. I looked up at the glass towers rising around us in the downtown Atlanta financial corridor. I told Fen that I had spent the last 10 years living in the shadows, trying to be a simple man for a daughter who despised simplicity. I said I was completely done hiding. Fen smiled sharp knowing. He asked what my plans were for the rest of the day. I told him I needed to go shopping. What you are about to hear is the moment when everything Gene had quietly put into motion came to a head, and the man standing across from him had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. Before we get there, tell me this. If someone you trusted had been slowly working against you behind your back, would you confront them directly, or would you let them walk right into their own trap? I shook his hand and walked away from the Atlanta FBI Financial Crimes Field Office, heading toward the most exclusive luxury retail district in the city. For a decade, I had bought my clothes at hardware stores and discount outlets. I had worn scuffed boots and faded jeans because they were comfortable and because they kept me grounded. But Vanessa had looked at those same clothes and seen a worthless embarrassment. She told me my cheap suits were a humiliation. She had demanded I keep my distance from her high society in-laws because I didn't look the part. I walked into the most prestigious tailoring establishment in the Buckhead luxury retail district, Atlanta. The showroom was lined with rich mahogany wood and carried the scent of imported wool and fine leather. The floor manager, a man dressed impeccably in a charcoal 3-piece suit, looked at me with a polite but thoroughly dismissive expression. He took in my modest sport coat and rough hands, clearly working out how quickly he could steer me back toward the door. He approached and asked whether I was lost or looking for the delivery entrance. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my wallet and drew out a heavy, solid black corporate card, the premier executive card for Hartley Commercial Real Estate, bearing my name and my title as Chief Executive Officer. I set it gently on the glass display counter. I told him I wasn't lost. I told him I needed a masterfully crafted tuxedo tailored to my exact measurements, and I needed it rushed for a very important event that Saturday. The manager's eyes moved from my face to the heavy black card resting on the glass. The dismissive posture evaporated entirely, replaced by a frantic, eager subservience. He dipped his head in a slight bow, apologizing at length for the misunderstanding, and immediately summoned the master tailor. For the next 2 hours, I stood before a 3-way mirror while a team of tailors measured, pinned, and adjusted the finest charcoal black wool I had ever touched. The fabric was remarkably light, yet held its structure perfectly settling around my shoulders like armor. They brought out a crisp white silk shirt, a hand-tied Windsor knotted tie, and a pair of polished leather derby shoes that gleamed beneath the showroom lights. As I studied my reflection, I watched the transformation take hold. The blue-collar disguise was peeling away, dropping to the floor with every pin the tailor set. The quiet, unassuming suburban handyman was gone. The man looking back at me from that mirror was a titan of industry, sharp, deliberate, and entirely unbothered by the opinions of shallow people. My daughter had demanded a high society wedding. She had demanded an atmosphere of absolute luxury, and she had barred her own father from it because she feared he'd ruin the aesthetic. I looked at the sleek charcoal black bespoke tuxedo and let a cold, hard smile cross my face. I was going to give her exactly what she'd asked for. I was going to walk through the doors of her wedding looking like the billionaire I truly was. And I was going to be wearing this beautiful suit while I watched her entire fraudulent world burn to the ground. Saturday arrived with a mocking perfection. The sky above the sprawling Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom, Johns Creek, Georgia, was a brilliant cloudless blue. Valets in crisp white shirts scrambled across the circular driveway, parking a steady parade of imported luxury cars. The manicured lawns stretched out like endless carpets of green velvet, leading up to a grand ballroom dressed with thousands of imported white roses. It was precisely the kind of high society spectacle my daughter had always believed she deserved. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate triumph of wealth and status. But beneath the expensive silk and the crystal chandeliers, it was nothing but a fragile house of cards waiting on a single gust of wind. Inside the sprawling bridal suite, Vanessa stood before a gilded mirror in a $15,000 gown covered in hand-stitched lace. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She smiled for the photographer and laughed easily with her bridesmaids, but her eyes were tight with a crushing hidden panic. The invisible safety net she had depended on her entire life was gone. She knew her luxury apartment was lost. She knew her trust fund was frozen. She was walking down the aisle completely blind, praying that the desperate financial promises her fiancé had made would somehow hold their crumbling world together through sheer force of will. She wore a brave face, needing every person in that room to believe she belonged in this circle. She had banned her own father to protect this flawless image, and now she was terrified the cracks were beginning to show. Downstairs in the grand ballroom, the groom was quietly coming apart. Derek was stationed near a towering ice sculpture, gripping a crystal flute of champagne like it was a life preserver. It was barely 1:00 in the afternoon, and he was already on his fourth glass. His tailored tuxedo jacket felt like a straitjacket. While the string quartet played softly in the corner, Derek was fixed on his cell phone screen, thumb swiping down to refresh his banking application every 30 seconds. He was tracking the status of the massive fraudulent wire transfer he had pushed through earlier in the week, stolen corporate funds used to pay the venue manager and keep the reception alive. The transaction had been stuck in a digital holding pattern since Thursday. He was sweating profusely, terrified that the Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom accounting office would not see cleared funds by the time the reception officially got underway. Every time the venue manager crossed the room with a clipboard, Derek's shoulders locked up, braced to be tapped on the arm and escorted out. He drained the rest of his champagne, his eyes sweeping the room, trapped inside a prison of his own construction. The walls of his lies were pressing in, but he forced a smile every time a guest passed, while his parents across the room remained completely oblivious to their son's impending felony arrest. Derek's parents were holding court at the center of the ballroom. His father and mother were turned out in their absolute finest drinking, in the attention of the 200 high society guests, assembled to witness what they believed was their family's crowning triumph. They stood near the cascading floral arrangements, expensive cocktails in hand, boasting to anyone within earshot. The very picture of arrogant privilege. His mother held forth endlessly about the exclusive designer behind the wedding gown, making certain every listener understood precisely what it had cost. His father praised his son's brilliant rise through the commercial real estate world in a loud, carrying voice. They told the senior partners from my firm that Derek was a financial prodigy destined to reshape the corporate landscape. They puffed out their chests, wholly unaware that every success they were celebrating had been financed by criminal embezzlement. They luxuriated in their illusion of superiority, looking down on anyone outside their tax bracket, so thoroughly drunk on the lie they had nurtured that the massive storm building directly overhead was entirely invisible to them. The guests mingled and laughed, clinking expensive glasses and toasting a union built entirely on theft and deception. The string quartet shifted into a lively classical piece, and servers began moving through the crowd with trays of expensive appetizers. It was a masterpiece of superficial perfection, but the financial deadline was counting down fast. Near the main entrance, the venue manager, a stern man in a dark suit, stood tapping a pen against his clipboard. He cast a sharp, expectant glance in Derek's direction. The Atlanta Athletic Club ballroom held a strict policy on outstanding balances, and the final payment had not yet posted to their ledger. Derek caught the manager's eye and felt a cold bead of sweat trace its way down his spine. He checked his phone one more time, his hand trembling badly enough that he nearly fumbled the device onto the polished marble floor. The wire transfer still read pending. He dragged the back of his hand across his damp forehead, completely unaware that federal authorities had already intercepted the money. He thought he was simply waiting on a sluggish banking system to release the funds. He believed that if he could buy a few more hours, he'd lock in his new wealthy life permanently. He had no idea the money was never going to clear. He had no idea the federal warrants were already signed and sealed. And most critically, he had absolutely no idea that the man he had berated in a dirty garage, the man he had banished from this pristine venue, was at that very moment stepping out of a chauffeured town car just beyond the main gates, preparing to walk through the front doors. The grand ballroom was a sea of glittering crystal and soft candlelight. The string quartet had moved into an elegant waltz, signaling the official start of the reception. Waiters in immaculate white coats circled the polished floor, carrying silver trays of champagne. Guests were drifting toward round tables, adorned with towering imported white garden roses. A gentle current of wealthy conversation rose and echoed against the vaulted ceilings. It was the absolute peak of high society grandeur, precisely the kind of evening my daughter had always insisted upon. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance moved, not simply opened, pushed wide apart with a slow, deliberate force that pulled the attention of every person in the back of that room. The groan of heavy brass hinges cut clean through the soft, classical music. Heads swiveled, conversations dissolved into a confused, uncomfortable silence. I crossed the threshold and walked into the grand ballroom. I was not in the faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots my daughter had always despised. I was not streaked with the motor oil she found so deeply humiliating. I was wearing a flawless charcoal black bespoke tuxedo. The fine Italian wool caught the light pouring down from the crystal chandeliers draping across my shoulders with razor-sharp precision. My white silk shirt was immaculate. My leather derby shoes gleamed against the hardwood floor. I did not look like a neighborhood mechanic who had slipped into a luxury event where he had no business being. I looked like a man who held the deed to the building itself. Walking one step behind my right shoulder was Mr. Fenn. My chief financial officer cut an impressively sharp figure in a tailored charcoal suit, a thick sealed manila folder tucked under his arm. He swept the room with the cold, detached gaze of a corporate executioner. We moved forward at a slow, measured pace, a steady advance through the sea of tables that carried absolute unyielding authority. The crowd's reaction was instant. A wave of whispers broke across the room, rippling from table to table. The high society guests did not recognize me as the father of the bride. To them, I was a powerful stranger who had just interrupted their exclusive gathering. The string quartet faltered, losing their tempo as the musicians registered the shifting atmosphere. The graceful waltz fell apart into a heavy, discordant silence. At the head table, half hidden behind a sweeping arrangement of white roses, Vanessa finally looked up. I watched the precise moment her eyes found mine. First came a flicker of pure confusion. She saw a wealthy, distinguished older man striding into her reception. Then recognition landed. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and stricken, but the terror curdled fast into a blinding, white-hot fury. She did not see the commanding titan of industry who owned the room. Her deeply ingrained arrogance blocked the reality standing right in front of her. All she saw was the father she had banished, the blue-collar embarrassment, who had the nerve to intrude on her perfect aesthetic. She shot to her feet so quickly her chair scraped hard against the marble floor. She grabbed fistfuls of her $15,000 lace gown, hauling the heavy fabric up so she could move. She left her new husband sitting alone at the head table and came marching straight across the polished dance floor. Her face was dark red with rage. Her jaw was clenched so tight I half expected to hear something crack. She cut me off halfway across the ballroom, planting herself directly in my path. The guests at the surrounding tables went stone silent, staring openly at the confrontation taking shape in the center of the room. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice buzzing with toxic, furious energy. She kept it low, fighting to hold the illusion of control, but her eyes were wild with panic. "I told you that you were an embarrassment. I told you specifically that your life is nothing to be proud of. I told you not to show up and ruin my day." I stopped walking. I looked down at the daughter I had quietly funded and shielded for 28 years. She was shaking with rage, breathing hard, utterly consumed by her own superficial pride. The opinions of the strangers seated in that room mattered more to her than her own flesh and blood. "I am not here to ruin your day, Vanessa," I said, my voice completely calm and stripped of any paternal warmth. "I am here to give you your wedding gift." She let out a sharp, hollow laugh. Her eyes moved to my charcoal black tuxedo, taking in the fine fabric and the perfect stitching. She sneered, certain I had rented the clothes burned through the last of my meager savings, just to spite her and manufacture a scene. "I do not want anything from you." She spat venom loaded into every word. "You do not belong in a place like this. You do not belong around these people. You are humiliating me just by breathing the same air as Derek and his family." She turned and snapped her fingers at a pair of venue security guards posted near the entrance. She leveled a trembling finger at my chest, demanding their attention at once. "Remove him," she ordered, raising her voice just enough for the front rows to catch it. "This man is trespassing. He is not on the guest list. I want him out of here right now." The two guards exchanged an uncertain look. They stepped forward with visible hesitation, clearly unsettled by the sheer authority radiating from where I stood. But before they could so much as reach for my arms, Mr. Fenn moved smoothly in front of me. He drew a crisp white business card from his breast pocket and placed it directly into the senior guard's hand. Mr. Fenn spoke in a voice carrying the full weight of corporate dominance. He informed the guard that the commercial property they were standing on was heavily mortgaged through a subsidiary of Hartley Commercial Real Estate. He advised that before they made the catastrophic career error of laying a hand on the chief executive officer of their parent company, they ought to step back and stay completely silent. The senior guard looked at the card, then looked back up at the bespoke tuxedo and the unshakable confidence the two of us projected. He swallowed hard, gave a single nod, and grabbed his partner by the shoulder. Both guards retreated, immediately melting away into the shadows near the wall, unwilling to intervene. Vanessa watched her security detail fall back in pure disbelief. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. The grand illusion of her control was fracturing right before her eyes. She looked back at me, her arrogant fury colliding with a sudden creeping dread. She could not understand how a simple mechanic had just dismissed two trained security guards with one business card. She could not understand why her worthless father was standing in a bespoke suit, looking like a billionaire holding court. I did not give her time to process the shock. I simply stepped around her, leaving her frozen and speechless on the dance floor, and continued my unhurried walk toward the head table. I had a delivery to make, and the groom was sweating in his chair, desperately waiting for the truth to reach him. I left my daughter standing motionless on the dance floor and kept moving. The distance to the head table felt impossibly short. The string quartet had gone completely silent. The only sound left in that vast ballroom was the sharp, rhythmic click of my leather shoes against the polished marble. Derek sat at the center of the long, elaborate head table, flanked by his parents. His father, a man with a booming voice and a silver watch worth more than a suburban house, was already on his feet. His face was swelling with indignation, chest thrust out in a display of wealthy arrogance. His mother clutched her pearl necklace, watching me the way you'd watch a stray animal that had wandered into a private dining room. They were ready to put the blue-collar mechanic firmly back in his place. But Derek did not stand. Derek could barely breathe. He had been staring at his phone all morning, refreshing his banking application over and over, waiting for stolen corporate money to clear and rescue his life. When he looked up and saw me, the man he had screamed at in a greasy garage just 2 days ago, walking toward him, not in a faded flannel shirt, but in a charcoal black bespoke tuxedo, carrying the absolute unyielding authority of a man who owned the very floor beneath his feet, his mind short-circuited completely. He looked at my face, then at the heavy manila folder tucked firmly under Mr. Fenn's arm. I reached the edge of the head table. Derek's father jabbed a manicured finger at my chest, loudly demanding to know who had let the help into the ballroom and threatening to have me arrested for trespassing. I did not blink. I did not acknowledge his existence. I simply held my hand out to the side. Mr. Fenn stepped forward and set the thick-sealed folder into my palm. I dropped it directly onto Derek's pristine white china plate. The heavy thud of paper rattled the crystal water glasses and carried across the silent room. I looked down at the sweating, squirming thief. My voice stayed low, but in that dead ballroom silence, it carried with lethal precision. I told him he'd been waiting on a wire transfer to clear that morning. I watched pure undiluted terror flood his eyes. I told him it wasn't going to clear. The $150,000 he'd attempted to steal from my company had been frozen by federal authorities at 8:00 that morning. Derek's father slapped his palm flat against the table, his face flooding a furious crimson. He bellowed that I was out of my mind, demanding to know who I thought I was speaking to, his accomplished son, that way threatening to have the police drag me out in irons. I finally turned my gaze on the arrogant man who had raised a criminal. I spoke in a voice that needed no volume, a voice tempered across decades in ruthless corporate boardrooms. I told him, my name is Eugene Hartley. I told him I am the founder and majority shareholder and chief executive officer of Hartley Commercial Real Estate, downtown Atlanta, Peachtree Street Corridor, Georgia. The company his son had ridden to build his counterfeit high society life belongs entirely to me. The color drained from Derek's face all at once, leaving him ashen. His jaw went slack, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an exit that wasn't there. The full weight of what he had done, of who he had insulted, hit him like something physical. His mother gasped sharply, covering her mouth with shaking hands. His father's pompous bluster collapsed right out of him. The wealthy titan they'd been boasting about all afternoon, the corporate giant they practically worshipped, was the very man they'd been sneering at. Vanessa had finally broken free from her frozen spot on the dance floor. She came rushing up behind me, breathless, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the marble. Tears of sheer panic were forming in her eyes. She stared at the thick audit file sitting on Derek's plate, then at the tailored tuxedo I wore, then at Mr. Fenn standing quietly beside me. Her mind was scrambling to close the enormous gap between the worthless father she had discarded and the billionaire now standing before her. She stammered, her voice unsteady, asking what was happening and what I had done to her perfect day. I turned slowly to face my daughter. My expression held not one trace of sympathy. I took in her perfectly arranged hair and her extravagant $15,000 lace gown. I looked at the panicked, grasping woman she had chosen to be. I reminded her of the exact words she'd used when she blocked the door to her luxury penthouse apartment and barred me from this room. I told her she had said my life was nothing worth being proud of. I told her she had called me a humiliating embarrassment who had no place in her elite world. I raised a single finger toward the thick corporate audit file sitting in front of her terrified criminal husband. I told her I had simply come to deliver her wedding gift. The heavy silence blanketing the grand ballroom was then split by the sound of deliberate heavy footsteps echoing in from the main entrance. Every head turned. The venue manager was crossing the polished marble floor, but the clipboard and the accommodating smile were gone. His face was pale and drawn tight with dread. Walking directly behind him, hands resting on their dark utility belts, were two uniformed officers. A collective gasp moved through all 200 high society guests. The low murmurs surged into frantic buzzing as the officers cut a direct path through the sea of white floral arrangements, heading straight for the head table. The venue manager arrived first. He offered no apology for the interruption and made no effort to lower his voice. He looked directly at Derek and stated that the large wire transfer initiated that morning had been officially flagged and seized by federal authorities. He announced to the entire room that the Atlanta Athletic Club Ballroom, Johns Creek, Georgia, had not received a single dollar for the reception. He declared the event entirely unpaid and effective immediately the wedding celebration was canceled. Before Derek could even open his mouth to spin another lie, the two officers stepped around the manager. They asked Derek to confirm his identity, a formality, nothing more. One officer gripped Derek's shoulder firmly and pulled him to his feet, while the other unclipped a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The officer began reading Derek his rights. His voice was clear and authoritative, filling every corner of the silent-stricken ballroom. He stated that Derek was being placed under arrest for corporate embezzlement and multiple counts of federal wire fraud. Derek tried to pull his arm free, insisting there had been a colossal misunderstanding, that he was a senior executive who could resolve this with a single phone call, but his resistance only made the officers move faster and with considerably less patience. The cold, sharp snap of the handcuffs locking around his wrists rang out like a gunshot in that quiet room. He was utterly trapped, his arrogant facade stripped away, reduced to a sweating, shaking criminal in front of every person he had ever tried to impress. Derek's father jolted out of his stunned paralysis. He lurched forward, chest puffed, demanding the officers release his son immediately. He shouted that they were ruining a private high society event and threatened to have their badges pulled by morning. He insisted his son was a brilliant, successful man with no reason to steal a dime from anybody. Mr. Fenn didn't let the officers waste their breath on explanations. He stepped calmly into the chaos and pressed a copy of the finalized corporate audit directly against the father's chest. Fenn suggested that before the man embarrassed himself defending a felon, he review the bank routing numbers and the forged offshore accounts detailed on page 4. He told the father that his brilliant, successful son had been funding his entire existence with stolen money and that the federal government already held every digital footprint needed to put him away for a very long time. Derek's father looked down at the documents, his eyes moving over undeniable proof of his son's guilt. The pompous indignation drained from him, completely leaving him looking shrunken and suddenly very old. His mother let out a loud, humiliated sob, burying her face in her hands, as the realization hit her that her entire social standing was crumbling in real time. They stepped back, watching helplessly, as the officers marched their handcuffed son away from the head table and walked him straight through the center of the grand ballroom. As the officers led Derek down the center aisle, he kept his head down. The colleagues he had talked down to, the people he'd bragged to, the socialites he had so desperately courted, were now pulling out their phones to capture his humiliating downfall. The 200 guests began rising from their tables, reaching for expensive coats, moving toward the exits, none of them wanting any association with a federal crime scene. I turned away from the thief and looked at my daughter. Vanessa was completely undone. She was shaking badly, her chest heaving as she fought to draw breath. She stared at the empty chair where her wealthy, successful groom had been sitting only moments before. Then she looked at the thick manila folder on the table, the reality settling over her that the criminal she had chosen to marry had just obliterated her entire future. Finally, she looked at me. She took in the charcoal black bespoke tuxedo, the quiet authority in how I stood, and the financial titan at my side. The horrific, devastating truth finally pieced itself together in her mind. She understood that the anonymous academic grants, the subsidized luxury apartment, and the flawless safety net she had floated on her entire life had never been luck. It had all been me. She had looked the multi-million-dollar foundation of her entire existence in the eye, called his life worthless, and banned him from her wedding because his work boots offended her shallow sense of taste. She realized she had no money to pay the venue manager standing over her. She had no home to go back to. Her lease had been canceled. She had no husband to provide for her. Her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed backward into a heavy wooden dining chair, the layers of her $15,000 lace dress pooling uselessly around her. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep, not from grief, but from the soul-crushing realization of her own catastrophic arrogance. She had traded a father who would have given her the world for a lying thief who had just taken everything she had left. I made no move to comfort her. I offered no shoulder, no outstretched hand. I simply straightened the cuffs of my jacket, took one long look at the smoldering wreckage of her perfect high society facade, and turned my back on all of it. I walked out of the grand ballroom in slow, deliberate strides, leaving her to sit alone in the ruins she had so fiercely insisted on building. 7 days had gone by since the ballroom cleared out. The dust had fully settled. I was back in my driveway on a quiet Tuesday morning, pushing a broom across the concrete and letting the stillness wash over me. No more board meetings, no frantic calls from the financial floor, just the scrape of the broom and the distant sound of birds. For me, the storm had passed completely. For my daughter, it was just now making landfall. A dented economy sedan rolled up to the curb, a budget rideshare, a stark contrast to the gleaming luxury cars she always used to demand. The passenger door swung open and Vanessa climbed out. She was nearly unrecognizable. Her once immaculate hair was yanked back in a matted, tangled knot. The designer wardrobe was gone, swapped for wrinkled sweatpants and a baggy sweater. Her face was drained of color, her eyes swollen and raw from days of relentless crying. The reality of life without my invisible safety net had struck her like a freight train with no brakes. She came up the driveway in slow, heavy steps. When she reached the edge of my garage, she didn't look at my work boots with contempt. She dropped straight to her knees on the bare concrete, buried her face in both hands, and broke down completely. The sound that came out of her was hollow and desperate, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. I did not rush forward. I did not offer comfort. I simply leaned the broom against the wall and waited for her to find words. She looked up at me, tears running freely down her face, voice barely holding together. She told me she had nothing left, not a single thing. She said the landlord had changed the locks on her luxury penthouse apartment that very morning, and her belongings were already piled in trash bags down in the lobby. The moment news of the federal arrest broke, her high society friends had stopped picking up her calls entirely. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were refused everywhere she tried. Then the pleading began, desperation dressed up as sorrow. She begged me to switch the trust fund back on. She pleaded with me to send my corporate attorneys to pull Derek out of federal custody. She wept that he was a good man who'd simply made a foolish mistake trying to give her the wedding she deserved. She told me that with my billions, I could make the criminal charges go away and put their lives back together. I looked down at the daughter who had thrown me out of hers. She wasn't apologizing for the cruelty. She wasn't apologizing for looking me in the eye and declaring my life worthless. She was sorry only because the money was gone. I kept my voice flat, completely stripped of warmth. I told her that Derek was a felon who had deliberately stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my company, and he was exactly where he belonged. I told her the trust fund was permanently dissolved, and the funds had already been redirected to charitable foundations. Panic flared in her swollen eyes. When she saw that the tears weren't softening my resolve, she reached for the cruelest weapon she still had left. She got to her feet, brushed the concrete dust from her knees, and let her voice go sharp and cutting. She invoked her mother's name. She told me that Lorraine would be utterly disgusted by what I was doing. She cried that Lorraine had loved her without condition, and that her mother would never have stood by while I turned my own flesh and blood out onto the street. She screamed that I was spitting on Lorraine's memory by abandoning her only child in her worst hour. She was trying to use my grief, the deepest, most private wound I carried, as a crowbar to pry open my resolve. Hearing her weaponize her mother's memory didn't shatter me. It hardened me. It forged whatever was left of my restraint into something cold and unbreakable. I held her gaze and spoke with quiet, lethal certainty. I told her that her mother and I built everything we had by working multiple exhausting jobs and living on cheap canned soup just to keep the lights on in our first small apartment. I told her that Lorraine valued integrity, hard work, and humility above every other thing in this world. I looked at Vanessa and told her that if her mother were standing on this driveway today, watching the shallow, grasping, arrogant woman she had chosen to be, Lorraine would be the one closing the door. The color left Vanessa's face entirely. The manipulative fury dissolved, replaced by something colder, a dawning, horrifying understanding. She finally grasped that there were no more buttons left to push, no more emotional strings to pull on. The deep well of parental forgiveness she had drawn from her entire life had run permanently dry. She stood trembling in the driveway of the house she had always looked down on, understanding at last that her blue-collar father was the only real wealth she had ever held, and she had discarded him for a criminal who left her with absolutely nothing. I looked at her there on the concrete. The silence between us stretched long and heavy. She was waiting for me to crack. She expected the old paternal instinct to surface, the one that had always rushed to press a bandage to her scraped knees when she was small. But that man was gone. I stood in the doorway of my home and felt nothing but a cold, settled finality. My posture didn't waver. I didn't shift my weight. I didn't fold my arms across my chest. I simply existed in the space she had tried so hard to push me out of. She dragged the sleeve of her oversized sweater across her face. She tried to move closer, one trembling hand reaching toward my arm. She whispered that she was my daughter. She asked where she was supposed to go tonight. She asked how she was supposed to eat, supposed to survive, no trust fund, no luxury apartment, nothing underneath her. She said she was terrified of a world without a safety net. I didn't step back, but I didn't let her reach me either. I looked at her outstretched hand, then up at her red, swollen eyes. I told her she was a 28-year-old adult. I told her that millions of people get up every single day, go to work, and earn the roof over their heads and the food on their tables. I told her it was time she joined that world. I told her she would find her way the same way her mother and I did before the empire existed, before any of it. She would have to earn it, sweep floors, wait tables, file papers, the same as everyone else. She shook her head, another hollow sob breaking loose. She asked how I could be this cruel to her. She asked how a father could simply turn away from his own family and leave them with nothing. I kept my voice level, didn't raise it a fraction. I told her I wasn't being cruel. I was giving her precisely what she had asked for. You measured my worth by what you thought I had in my wallet. You told me to stay out of your life because I embarrassed you. I am simply honoring that request. Her jaw trembled. Her mouth opened, searching for another angle, another thread to pull, another story to spin. I didn't give her the opening. I turned briefly and reached into the entryway of the house. On the small wooden bench sat a single plain cardboard box. I had packed it before sunrise while the neighborhood was still dark. Inside were the last remaining traces of the girl I once knew, a few framed photographs from her childhood, her old softball trophies from middle school, and the hand-painted clay ornaments she used to make me for Father's Day. The physical evidence of a daughter who no longer existed. I turned back and held the box out to her. She took it automatically, her hands gripping the brown cardboard, as though she hadn't quite processed what it was. I told her these were her things. I told her there was nothing left for her in this house. I stepped back over the threshold and pulled the heavy front door closed between us. She stood frozen on the driveway, clutching that box of her past against her chest. She didn't scream. She didn't try to force her way inside. She simply stared at me with wide, frightened eyes as the full weight of her choices settled over her like something she couldn't breathe through. I held her gaze one final time and pushed the door shut. The heavy wood met the frame with a solid, resonant thud that traveled through the floorboards. I reached up and turned the brass deadbolt. The sharp metallic snap of the lock sliding home rang out in the quiet entryway. It was the clean, definitive sound of a poisoned bond being cut for good. I did not lean in to check the peephole and watch her cry. I did not drift to the front window to see how long she stood there waiting for her budget ride share to pull away. I simply turned from the door, walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, and sat down at the table. The house was utterly still. The air felt strangely light. The longest chapter of my life had finally closed. 6 months went by, carrying with them a quiet but absolute reckoning. The seasons turned, and so did the fortunes of the people who once believed they were untouchable. Derek was not granted the comfort of some white-collar arrangement. The federal judge was unmoved by his arrogant explanations. He was sentenced to 7 years in a federal facility for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. No tailored suits in that cell, just a standard-issue uniform and a long, empty stretch of time to reckon with the life he had burned down through his own greed. As for my daughter, the unforgiving light of reality finally forced her eyes open. With my invisible safety net gone, she had to face what it actually costs to exist in the real world. Word reached me through the grapevine that her high society circle dropped her the instant the money dried up. She was left with no choice but to take a minimum wage retail job, folding clothes, managing impatient customers 8 hours a day on her feet. She rides the public bus now to a small rented room, nowhere near the elite zip codes she once demanded. It is a hard, humbling life, but it is precisely the education she always needed and never received. She is learning for the first time what a single hard-earned dollar actually means, with nobody there to cushion the lesson. I don't check on her, and I carry no bitterness. The anger that set everything in motion burned itself out long ago, leaving behind something unexpected, a deep-settled quiet. I spent decades constructing an empire, then spent another decade hiding from it. Now, I am finally putting it to use the way my late wife and I always talked about. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, and I was standing before a large, newly built brick building at the center of our community. Fresh paint caught the sunlight, and the sound of children laughing drifted over from the playground around back. Above the main double doors, a handsome bronze plaque read, "Lorraine Hartley Youth Community Center." I had funded the whole project, stepping just far enough out of the corporate shadows to make certain my wife's legacy was anchored in something permanent. She always believed that children deserved a safe place to grow and learn. Now that belief was standing in brick and mortar, and I wasn't standing there by myself. I was surrounded by people who knew my name but had no interest in the size of my accounts. Ruth Ann, my warm, sharp-witted elderly neighbor, stood right beside me, holding a tray of her famous cookies to pass around to the neighborhood kids. Mr. Fenn had even made the drive down from the corporate office, trading his press suit for a comfortable sweater just to be there for the opening. They looked at me, not as a billionaire chief executive, but simply as a decent man and a good friend. That kind of regard meant more to me than any portfolio figure ever had. The afternoon sun began its slow drop toward the horizon, spreading a warm amber glow across the face of the new building. I said my goodbyes to Ruth Ann and the rest of the community board. A genuine warmth settled deep in my chest. I crossed the freshly paved parking lot toward my classic Ford F-100 pickup. I hadn't traded it in for anything sleeker. I still loved the smell of motor oil and the low familiar rumble when the engine turned over. I pulled myself up into the driver's seat, felt the worn leather settle against my back, and rolled both windows all the way down. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I want to thank you for that. This story took a lot out of me to tell, and I mean that sincerely. Looking back on everything Jean endured, the years of being quietly dismissed, the daughter who mistook his humility for worthlessness, the long patience it took to let the truth surface on its own, none of it was painless. It cost him something real. But I believe God has a way of using the years, when nobody is watching, to build something that nobody can easily dismantle. Jean never stopped working. He never stopped building. And in the end, the life his daughter called embarrassing turned out to be the only thing standing between her and ruin. Here is what I take away from a story like this: the kind of father story that reminds you how much can go unseen for far too long. First, never confuse a quiet man for an empty one. Humility and weakness are not the same thing, and the people who mistake one for the other usually find that out too late. Second, if you are going to cut someone out of your life, make sure you truly understand what they carry, because you may be walking away from the very foundation you are standing on. Third, real dad's revenge is never loud. It is patient, it is documented, and it is delivered at the moment of someone else's choosing, not yours. Fourth, build a legacy worth naming after someone you love. That is the only monument that lasts. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they mean more than you know. And if you have not yet subscribed to his Hidden Revenge, now is a good time. New stories are waiting for you. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.